Michael Torres had always believed that a house should be more than walls and a roof, more than a place to sleep and store belongings, more than a convenient investment that could be bought and sold when the market dictated. For him, a house was a reflection of its creator's philosophy, a living statement of how humans ought to coexist with the environment, a bridge between art and practicality. When he finally allowed himself to design and build his own cabin, away from the suffocating constraints of federal projects and government committees, he poured into it the years of discipline and vision that had defined his career. The cabin stood on a parcel of land he had purchased legally and with absolute transparency, a quiet slope overlooking a valley framed by dark pines and distant ridges. The construction had taken months of painstaking work, but to Michael it never felt like labor. It felt like sculpting something alive. Each beam of timber was measured twice and cut once with his own hands, every joint sanded and polished to ensure the structure would endure long after he was gone. The walls were thick but not oppressive, built from reclaimed wood that bore the silent history of barns and mills long abandoned, yet reshaped into something modern, resilient, and quietly defiant against the idea that progress required waste. The design blended contemporary minimalism with traditional craftsmanship, the large windows drawing daylight into the interior while also framing the surrounding wilderness like moving paintings that changed with every season. This was not just a personal retreat, it was a working laboratory for new methods of sustainable construction. Michael was a federal architect with projects scattered across the country in national parks, visitor centers, and government complexes that demanded the highest levels of scrutiny and compliance. He was accustomed to layers of bureaucracy, inspections, and the slow grind of approval processes that could stretch on for years. That was precisely why the cabin mattered so much to him. Here he could design without endless committees trimming away the spirit of his ideas. Here he could test insulation materials, passive heating systems, and new structural techniques that could one day be implemented on a national scale. Every corner of the cabin represented a quiet rebellion against mediocrity, a testament that architecture could remain both functional and poetic even under modern pressures. Yet, beyond the professional pride, there was something deeper binding him to this place. Michael had never been a man prone to sentimentality, but the cabin became an extension of himself in a way no office or apartment ever had. The silence of the mountains wrapped around it like a protective shell, a contrast to the constant noise of Washington where he spent most of his life. Here, surrounded by air sharp with pine resin and nights filled with the low hum of wind through trees, he could finally hear himself think. His neighbors were distant, barely visible through the folds of the terrain, and he had chosen this particular parcel precisely because it offered space from the endless conformity of suburban developments. The road was rough, the winters harsh, but Michael embraced those difficulties as part of the authenticity of the land. He never intended this cabin to be a hidden fortress nor a hermit's cave. It was a home where design, nature, and solitude wove together into something rare. He imagined that in time, he might host colleagues here to show them what was possible when you ignored the usual compromises, perhaps inspire younger architects to think beyond the templates that suffocated creativity. But above all, he imagined simply living within it, slowly, attentively, watching how the building aged with the landscape, how the wood shifted with weather, how the light carved patterns across the floors in autumn. For once in his life, he felt that he had created not for a client or a committee, but for himself, and that alone gave the cabin a sacred quality he had never experienced in his career. Michael did not expect trouble. He knew that the property technically lay within the boundaries of a neighborhood association, but the cabin was positioned on the very edge of their jurisdiction, and he had meticulously checked the bylaws before construction. Everything he had done was legal, documented, and in accordance with both state and county regulations. More importantly, his federal status gave him a confidence that no local committee could ever challenge him on matters of compliance. The cabin was not a violation of community aesthetics but a demonstration of innovation. It was not a reckless project, but a careful experiment rooted in knowledge. He assumed that even the most rigid homeowner association would recognize the difference. And yet, as he locked the door on his first night sleeping there, inhaling the scent of fresh cedar and smoke from the small fireplace, he had a faint unease he could not place, a flicker of awareness that something so carefully crafted, so proudly independent, would inevitably attract the wrong kind of attention. Michael had been living in his new cabin for just over a month when the first sign of trouble arrived, though at first he did not recognize it for what it was. One late afternoon, as the light softened into amber and shadows stretched across the timber floor, he heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on the gravel drive. It was unusual enough to make him pause. Few people ever came this far uninvited, and the narrow road was not one that casual travelers stumbled upon by accident. When he stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag still scented faintly of resin, he saw a gleaming, white SUV with tinted windows pulling up slowly, deliberately, as if the driver wanted to announce their presence without rushing into the encounter. The vehicle came to a halt, and out stepped a woman in a pressed beige suit, her hair lacquered into a neat helmet, her heels clicking with surprising authority on the rough stones. She carried a folder under her arm and wore a smile that was not so much welcoming as evaluative, the kind that belonged to someone already certain of their superiority. She introduced herself, crisply, as Karen Holloway, president of the Ridgeview Homeowners Association, and before Michael could even respond, she extended the folder toward him, her manicured fingers resting on the edge as if reluctant to let go. He accepted it cautiously, already noticing the embossed HOA insignia on the cover, and flipped through the first pages while she began to speak in a tone that sounded practiced, rehearsed, and heavy with self-importance. According to Karen, his cabin was an unapproved structure, erected in violation of community guidelines, and the HOA board had voted unanimously to issue a formal directive requiring that the building be demolished within 60 days. The phrasing was cold, bureaucratic, and absolute. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines, legal action, and possible foreclosure proceedings. Michael listened in silence at first, his mind cataloging every absurdity in her words. He knew the property was his, lawfully purchased and properly recorded. He knew every permit had been secured through the county offices, signed and sealed by officials who had reviewed his plans with the kind of scrutiny he was long accustomed to. He knew the HOA had no jurisdiction over federal designations or the right to demand demolition of a privately owned structure that adhered to state law. And yet here stood this woman, on his porch, acting as though her committee of retirees and volunteers wielded greater authority than the county itself. When he tried to interrupt, Karen's voice grew sharper, as though cutting him off was her prerogative. She claimed that his cabin disrupted the architectural harmony of the neighborhood, that it was inconsistent with the historical aesthetic, and that several neighbors had lodged complaints. Michael, with a mix of irritation and disbelief, asked her to name those neighbors, to specify what rule he had broken, to show him the legal foundation for this directive. Karen smiled, thin and brittle, and replied that the rules were clear to anyone who cared to read them properly, then turned back toward her SUV as if the matter were already settled. Left with the folder in hand, Michael retreated inside and spread the documents across the kitchen table. What he found was both laughable and unsettling. Photocopied pages of community covenants written decades ago, referencing guidelines about paint colors, mailbox dimensions, and lawn maintenance, none of which applied to his parcel. In fact, the boundaries outlined in the original HOA charter didn't even include his land, a fact he had confirmed when purchasing the property. Yet someone had highlighted certain vague passages, structures inconsistent with neighborhood character, and unauthorized development subject to board review, and presented them as justification for erasing his cabin entirely. The directive bore no legal signature, no stamp from county officials, no reference to state law, only the looping cursive of Karen Holloway herself beneath the title, President, Ridgeview HOA. For a time, Michael simply sat in silence, letting the absurdity wash over him. He was not a man easily rattled by bureaucracy. After years of navigating federal agencies, he had grown accustomed to paperwork thicker than bricks in meetings where 3 hours could be consumed debating the angle of a single doorway. But what disturbed him here was not the incompetence of the paperwork, it was the confidence with which it had been delivered. Karen had looked him directly in the eye as though she fully expected him to crumble, as though her authority were unquestionable. It was the psychology of control, not the substance of law, that gave her power, and he realized that many homeowners before him must have yielded simply to avoid conflict. The following week brought more reminders that this was no idle threat. Michael returned from a supply run in town to find a bright yellow notice taped to his front door, echoing the same directive with even harsher language about fines and liens. Another day, he discovered an envelope tucked beneath his windshield wiper while his truck was parked at the trailhead, warning of daily penalties accruing for his non-compliance. Then came the knock at his door one evening. 3 HOA board members standing in a stiff row on his porch, their smiles brittle, their voices dripping with a false civility as they encouraged him to work with them for the sake of community peace. They spoke of bylaws as though they were scripture, gestured toward his cabin with thinly veiled disdain, and repeated the refrain that it must come down before it poisoned the integrity of Ridgeview. Michael pushed back calmly, citing his permits, his purchase records, even inviting them to contact the county offices themselves. But the more he resisted, the more their tone hardened, shifting from polite persuasion to veiled threats. One man muttered that refusal to comply could complicate his tax assessments. Another implied that emergency inspections might find code violations if the board were forced to escalate matters. It was a theater of intimidation, carefully staged, and Michael recognized it for what it was, an attempt to wear him down not through law, but through exhaustion. He could already imagine how this would play out for most homeowners. Alone, uncertain, overwhelmed, they would simply capitulate rather than face months of letters, visits, and harassment. That night, sitting by the small fire with the yellow notice still in his hands, Michael felt the first real twinge of unease. It wasn't fear of losing the cabin. He knew the law was on his side, but the realization that the HOA operated in a world where perception mattered more than truth. If they could convince enough neighbors that he was in violation, if they could flood him with paperwork and threats, if they could twist the narrative into one of a stubborn outsider refusing to respect community standards, then the battle would not be about deeds or permits, but about stamina. And in that arena, they believed, they held the advantage. Still, he was not one to yield. He had faced government auditors dissecting every decimal of a budget, senators demanding impossible compromises, engineers insisting on the limits of physics. Compared to that, Karen Holloway and her polished intimidation felt like a petty challenge, and yet the persistence with which she moved unnerved him. The catalyst had been set. What began as a dream cabin, a statement of independence and craft, had become the center of a looming confrontation. Michael knew the fight ahead would not be about wood, glass, or nails, but about the right to exist without bending to the small tyrannies of those who mistook authority for ownership. Michael had not expected the situation to escalate so quickly. Yet within a matter of weeks, the quiet life he had imagined in his cabin was interrupted almost daily by reminders that the Homeowners Association had no intention of letting the matter go. The visits became more frequent, the letters more aggressive, and the tone of every interaction with Karen Holloway more brazenly hostile, as though her certainty in her position grew stronger each time he refused to bend. He recognized the tactic from his years working in government projects. When the facts were weak, the strategy was to overwhelm with persistence, bury the opponent in so many demands and accusations that the exhaustion itself would force compliance. What startled him, however, was how quickly the HOA's narrative began to seep into the community. One neighbor, who had once waved politely when passing on the road, now avoided his gaze altogether. Another, who had initially expressed admiration for the unique design of the cabin, suddenly remarked in a clipped tone that rules exist for a reason. Michael saw the subtle but deliberate isolation forming, the slow erosion of goodwill that could turn him from a respected architect into an unwanted outsider with the stroke of a rumor. The first real confrontation occurred at a scheduled HOA meeting, one Michael attended not because he believed it would bring resolution, but because he needed to show publicly that he would not be cowed into silence. The meeting was held in a community hall at the edge of the neighborhood, a low brick building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. He arrived with a folder of his own: property deeds, county permits, stamped architectural plans, every official document that could prove the legality of his cabin. When his item appeared on the agenda, Karen took the floor with the ease of someone accustomed to holding it, her voice carrying through the hall with polished conviction. She spoke not of law or permits, but of community harmony, of aesthetic consistency, and of the dangers of unchecked development. With deliberate theatrics, she held up enlarged photographs of his cabin as though it were a grotesque intrusion, framing it in language that made it sound like a threat to the very identity of Ridgeview. The audience, a collection of homeowners who had likely come only to discuss landscaping fees or trash collection, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the images and the man seated calmly with his folder of papers. When Michael rose to respond, he spoke with the measured confidence that had carried him through congressional hearings and federal design reviews. He presented his documents one by one, explaining how each bore the signature of county officials, how every requirement had been met, how the cabin's design adhered not only to law but to principles of sustainability that should have been a source of pride for the community. His words were not loud but steady, imbued with the authority of someone who knew his craft and his rights. Yet as he spoke, he could see the way Karen leaned back in her chair, smiling faintly, as though none of it mattered. She interrupted only once, at a pointed moment, to declare that Ridgeview was not governed by county officials but by the will of its residents, and if the residents found his cabin disruptive, then his permits were meaningless here. The statement drew a ripple of murmurs, and Michael realized with a chill that truth and legality were less important in this room than perception and fear. By the end of the meeting, no resolution had been reached, but the effect was clear. Karen had managed to seed doubt. Several neighbors approached him afterward, not to offer support, but to ask nervously if it was true that his property had been built without authorization, if perhaps he had overlooked some requirement. It did not matter that he showed them stamped papers. They nodded politely and walked away with uncertainty lingering in their eyes. That was when Michael understood that the battle would not be fought in documents alone. It would be fought in the realm of influence, rumor, and intimidation, a realm where Karen thrived. The escalation took another form. Days later, when Michael returned from a long hike to find a white sedan idling at the edge of his drive. Inside were two men in matching polo shirts embroidered with the HOA emblem, clipboards resting on their laps. They claimed to be conducting a site inspection on behalf of the board and demanded access to his property. When he asked under what authority they were operating, one of them recited a bylaw number with the rote delivery of someone who knew few would ever check its validity. Michael refused entry, pointing out that any inspection required county authorization, not a neighborhood committee's approval, and after a tense standoff, the men left, scribbling something on their clipboards with exaggerated strokes as though to remind him that they would be back. That night, another notice appeared on his door, this one citing obstruction of inspection as a violation subject to immediate fines. It was absurd, but the pattern was unmistakable. They were fabricating infractions faster than he could disprove them. More troubling than the official harassment were the smaller, subtler signs that Karen was orchestrating a campaign against him beyond paperwork. One morning, he discovered tire tracks cutting across the edge of his property where no vehicle had reason to be. Another time, a pile of broken branches and trash appeared just inside his fence line, as though someone had deliberately dumped it there to blur the boundary between his land and common space. He knew these were not accidents. They were signals, little invasions meant to unsettle him, to remind him that the HOA's reach extended into the fabric of his daily life. And always there was Karen, her SUV parked strategically near the community hall or rolling past his property at slow speed, her gaze lingering just long enough to make it clear that she was watching. Michael responded not with panic, but with preparation. He began documenting everything, each notice, each visit, each unexplained disturbance. He wrote detailed accounts of conversations, keeping records with the precision of an architect drafting blueprints. But the more thorough he became, the more he recognized the true danger, that this would not end with one battle of documents. Karen's strategy was to drag him into an endless war of attrition, where each victory on his part would be followed by another accusation, another complaint, another fabricated violation. The escalation had already begun, and he could feel the noose tightening, not legally but socially. Every step he took was under scrutiny. Every refusal twisted into proof of defiance, every word reinterpreted as arrogance. The cabin, once his sanctuary, had become the stage of a conflict that was only beginning to show its teeth, and Michael knew that the first real blows had just been struck. Michael had reached the point where he could no longer treat the battle with Ridgeview HOA as a nuisance to be endured or brushed aside. What had begun as a series of notices and staged encounters had grown into a steady campaign, coordinated with unnerving precision, and the pattern of it made clear that this was not an argument about community aesthetics but a calculated effort to strip him of legitimacy as a property owner. The turning point came not with another letter taped to his door or another hostile look from a neighbor, but in the quiet sterility of the county records office, where he expected to find reassurance and instead discovered something far more troubling. He had gone there on a gray morning, the sky low with clouds, carrying a binder filled with every document he had meticulously collected since the purchase of the property. His intention was simple: to obtain a fresh certified copy of the deed, stamped and signed, something that would silence even the most obstinate claim by Karen or her board. The clerk at the counter, a tired-looking man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, took the request without comment and disappeared into the back. Michael waited, tapping his fingers against the cool surface of the desk, confident that in a few minutes the clerk would return with exactly what he needed. But when the man came back, he was frowning, a thin crease of unease across his forehead, and he asked Michael to confirm the parcel number again. Michael repeated it, certain of every digit, but the clerk shook his head slowly and explained that the most recent entry associated with that parcel had been amended 2 weeks earlier. According to the system, ownership had reverted to a community designation, pending review, a classification used when property boundaries were in dispute. For a moment, Michael thought it must be a clerical error, a technical glitch easily remedied, but the printout the clerk handed him left no room for such optimism. His name had vanished from the official record. In its place was a notation referencing the Ridgeview Homeowners Association, alongside a cryptic reference to oversight of disputed development. He felt his stomach tighten as he read, the kind of slow burn of anger that comes not from surprise, but from recognition of deliberate manipulation. Someone had reached into the bureaucracy and altered the foundation upon which his ownership rested. Without that record, every argument he had made about permits and legality could be painted as irrelevant, and Karen surely knew it. He pressed the clerk for details, asking who had authorized the change, but the man could only shrug helplessly and point to a vague code in the system that traced back to a request filed electronically. No name, no signature, no paper trail that could be challenged. Michael left the office with the printout folded in his pocket, his jaw set, his mind racing through possibilities. He had worked with enough agencies to know that changes of this kind were not mistakes. They were engineered, slipped through by someone counting on the fact that few would bother to question them. By the time he reached the cabin again, the sense of violation was overwhelming, as though an unseen hand had reached into his life and attempted to erase him from the ground itself. The following days confirmed his fears. A letter arrived, this time not on HOA stationery but on the letterhead of a local law firm, claiming to represent Ridgeview in a forthcoming petition to clarify property rights. The tone was smugly professional, written in dense paragraphs that threatened legal fees and injunctions if he attempted to resist. What made Michael pause was the timing. The letter referenced the very amendment he had just discovered at the county office, as though the HOA had anticipated his steps, had already built the next move before he had taken the last one. It was chess, not checkers, and Karen was several moves ahead using tools he had not yet seen. But Michael was not naive. He had spent his career watching how power bent rules, how influence turned paperwork into weapons sharper than blades. He understood that the battle was no longer about his cabin alone, but about the precedent it represented. If Ridgeview could erase his ownership with a few keystrokes, they could do the same to anyone else, and the community's silence was proof that fear of disruption outweighed the defense of fairness. He decided he could not fight this in isolation. He began visiting the oldest neighbors, those who had lived through decades of changes, knocking on their doors not to demand allegiance but to ask questions. At first they were reluctant, eyes darting toward the street as though afraid of being overheard, but slowly pieces of a larger picture emerged. One elderly man admitted that years earlier his property line had been corrected in a similar way, forcing him to cede a strip of land behind his garden. A woman, her voice trembling with both shame and anger, recounted how she had been pressured to sell after the HOA declared her cottage unsafe, even though county inspectors had found no fault. Each story was a thread, and as Michael gathered them, he began to see the tapestry of a scheme far older and more entrenched than his own conflict. The midpoint of his struggle came late one night as he sat at the cabin's rough-hewn table, papers spread before him, when he realized that the fight was not merely defensive. It could not be won by waiting for the next accusation and responding with proof. He would need to turn the offense, to expose the manipulation rather than merely deny its existence. He thought of the altered record at the county office, the anonymous amendment, the law firm already prepared to exploit it. Somewhere, hidden behind the facade of the community spirit, was a deliberate conspiracy to seize land piece by piece, cloaked in the respectability of bylaws and architectural harmony. His cabin had become the lightning rod because it was new, prominent and defended by someone unwilling to yield. But it was not the first target and would not be the last. The realization hardened him. He began to assemble his evidence not as a stack of defensive rebuttals but as a case to be presented. He cataloged the stories of neighbors, carefully noting dates and corroborating details. He copied every notice and letter, highlighting contradictions in the language. He marked the discrepancies between county permits and HOA claims, building a file that looked less like a homeowner's defense and more like a prosecutor's brief. He knew the time would come when it must be placed before a judge, and when that day came, it would not be Ridgeview's word against his. It would be Ridgeview against its own record of deceit. And yet, beneath the methodical preparation was the unshakable unease of living under siege. Each night he found himself glancing out the windows more often than before, scanning the tree line as though expecting headlights or figures moving in the shadows. Each morning he wondered which new notice would greet him, what fresh fiction the HOA would invent. His cabin, once conceived as a sanctuary, had become a fortress under quiet attack, every beam and window a reminder of defiance. But it was also, paradoxically, the place where his resolve grew. For every tactic Karen deployed, for every manipulation that appeared in the records, Michael felt the weight of purpose settle heavier on his shoulders. This was no longer simply about protecting a home. It was about proving that even in the smallest corners of power, where neighbors sat on boards and played at governance, truth could not be erased without consequence. By the time the snow began to fall that winter, layering the roof in clean silence, Michael knew the battle had crossed its midpoint. He had uncovered the evidence of forgery in the very system that should have protected him, and in doing so he had illuminated the path ahead. There would be more attacks, more attempts to isolate him, but he no longer felt like a man cornered. He felt like a man standing at the threshold of exposure, holding the threads of a story that, once pulled into the open, would unravel the carefully woven facade of Ridgeview's authority. The middle of the war had passed. The second half, far more dangerous and decisive, was about to begin. Michael had thought the worst of the assault might already be behind him, that once he had discovered the altered records and identified the pattern of manipulation, he could begin preparing for the legal confrontation that was clearly coming. What he did not anticipate was how quickly the homeowners association would escalate, shifting from bureaucratic harassment into something far more personal and insidious. It began with another letter, but unlike the earlier notices taped to his door or tucked under his windshield wiper, this one was delivered by certified mail, signed for by a postal worker who insisted he initial the receipt. The envelope bore the letterhead of the same law firm that had first threatened him, but its contents struck a new tone. This was no longer framed as a dispute over aesthetics or harmony, but as an accusation of fraudulent ownership. The language suggested that his deed itself might be invalid, referencing the uncertainty of title that had arisen from the county's amended records, and hinting darkly that continued possession of the property could expose him to charges of misrepresentation. Michael read it twice, his pulse tightening with anger rather than fear, recognizing immediately that the strategy had shifted. They were attempting not just to remove his cabin but to smear his integrity, to paint him as the violator rather than the victim. The following week brought a more visceral reminder of how far they were willing to go. One evening, returning from town after dusk, he found the gravel drive leading up to his cabin littered with broken glass, glinting like sharp ice under the beam of his headlights. He stopped just short, stepping out into the cold to examine it, and saw that the shards were not random but scattered deliberately in a thick line across the narrow road. It was the kind of crude sabotage that could shred tires, leaving him stranded miles from help, and the realization that someone had come onto his land to do it filled him with a dark, simmering fury. He cleared the debris in silence, hauling bucket after bucket of glass until the road was passable again. But as he worked, he understood that this was not an act of vandalism by bored teenagers. It was targeted, calculated, an unspoken message that the fight was no longer confined to letters and meetings. The next escalation came in the form of neighbors themselves. At first, it was only whispers when he passed, eyes that lingered a moment too long before sliding away, but soon the whispers became confrontations. One neighbor approached him at the market, voice low but sharp, saying he should stop causing trouble for everyone else because his defiance was driving up the association's legal costs that would soon be passed down to all residents through increased fees. Another claimed he had heard that Michael's cabin was structurally unsafe, that inspectors had already flagged it as a hazard, and when Michael demanded to know where that information came from, the man only shrugged and muttered, "People talk." It was obvious who had seeded the rumors. Karen's board had succeeded in turning the community against him, not by proving their case, but by reframing the narrative. He was not a property owner defending his rights, but an arrogant outsider threatening the stability of the neighborhood. Still, the most striking escalation arrived with a knock at his door on a bleak Saturday morning. Standing there was a county code officer, clipboard in hand, explaining that he had been dispatched to conduct a safety inspection after receiving multiple complaints. The officer was polite enough, almost apologetic, but the implication was clear. Someone had filed formal grievances alleging that the cabin was a fire hazard, that its foundations were unsound, that it posed a danger to the surrounding forest. Michael allowed the inspection, knowing full well that everything had been built to the strictest standards, and as expected the officer left with nothing to report, promising to file a clean record. Yet the damage was already done. Karen and her board had forced the county to intervene, weaponizing official channels to harass him, and Michael realized they would not stop with one inspection. Every agency, every loophole, every technicality could be bent into a weapon, and he would be forced to respond again and again until exhaustion broke him. What made the escalation even more sinister was the discovery that Karen had begun canvassing the neighborhood with petitions, gathering signatures not only to demand demolition of his cabin, but to initiate proceedings that would grant the HOA broader powers over disputed land. It was a direct attempt to rewrite the bylaws retroactively, to legalize what had already been done to him. Some residents signed out of fear, some out of confusion, others because they had been fed lies about his ownership. But each signature represented a tightening noose. When Michael confronted one of the signatories, a man he had spoken with amiably in the past, the neighbor admitted with embarrassment that he had signed only because Karen warned that refusing would mark him as complicit in the disruption. The atmosphere had shifted from annoyance to coercion, from passive hostility to active pressure, and Michael found himself not only defending his property but resisting the quiet bullying of an entire community. Through it all, he remained methodical, gathering evidence, documenting each escalation with the precision that had defined his professional life. He wrote detailed reports of the inspection, photographed the glass on the driveway before removing it, collected testimonies from the few neighbors still willing to speak honestly. But beneath the calm surface was the growing recognition that this was no longer about winning or losing a property dispute. The HOA's strategy had evolved into character assassination, an effort to grind him down until he either abandoned the cabin or emerged so tarnished that even victory would feel hollow. They were not seeking justice, they were seeking submission, and submission was the one thing he could never allow himself to give. By the end of that winter, with the snow piled high against the cabin walls and the valley hushed in silence, Michael felt the weight of the escalation pressing down on him. He knew the next phase would be the courtroom, and he knew Karen was preparing her narrative with the same smug confidence she had displayed since the first day she drove up in her SUV. But he also knew something she did not. He had transformed from a defensive homeowner into a man ready to prosecute, and every attack they had launched had only armed him further. The second escalation was complete, the lines were drawn, and the confrontation that awaited would determine not just the fate of his cabin, but the integrity of every lie Ridgeview had built its power upon. The courthouse was not unfamiliar territory to Michael, but stepping into it this time felt entirely different from the hearings and reviews of his professional life. He had testified before federal panels and defended architectural proposals worth millions, but never had he walked into a courtroom carrying the weight of his own home on his shoulders. The chamber itself was modest, lined with oak benches polished by decades of restless hands, and the smell of paper and old wood hung faintly in the air. At the front sat the judge, a woman with sharp eyes who seemed determined to tolerate no theatrics, and on either side stood the representatives of two visions of authority. On one, the law firm representing Ridgeview HOA, their suits pressed, their folders stacked high with glossy exhibits. On the other, Michael himself, armed with nothing but his binder of documents, his notes, and the unwavering clarity of someone who had lived every detail of the truth. Karen Holloway entered with her entourage, dressed immaculately as always, her lips curved in that practiced smile that managed to appear both gracious and triumphant. She sat with her lawyers, whispering occasionally, her confidence radiating through every gesture. Michael could almost feel the narrative they intended to spin. The arrogant architect who believed himself above community rules, the outsider who defied the harmony of Ridgeview, the man who had no respect for the neighbors around him. They had already planted those seeds in the petitions and the rumors. Now they sought to make them bloom under oath. When the proceedings began, the HOA's counsel wasted no time. They presented photographs of the cabin, angled and cropped to make it look out of place among the older houses, describing it as an unauthorized intrusion that violated the uniform character of the development. They produced petitions with dozens of signatures demanding its removal, and they waived before the court the amended county record, claiming it as evidence that Michael's ownership itself was in doubt. Every word was carefully measured, designed not to prove illegality but to suggest impropriety, to tilt the perception of the judge against him. Michael sat quietly through it, his expression calm, though his chest tightened with the injustice of hearing his work distorted into something malicious. When his turn came, he rose slowly, carrying his binder to the podium. He did not raise his voice nor indulge in flourishes. Instead, he laid out his evidence step by step. The original deed signed and certified by the county clerk, the stamped permits authorizing construction, the inspection reports verifying the cabin's compliance with every safety code. He presented the letters from Ridgeview, each contradictory in language, highlighting how the association had shifted its justification again and again depending on convenience. And finally, with deliberate care, he produced the death certificate of the notary whose name appeared on the forged amendment, proving beyond dispute that the key document underpinning Ridgeview's case could not possibly have been legitimate. For a moment the courtroom was utterly still. The judge leaned forward, examining the papers herself, then fixed the HOA's attorneys with a gaze so sharp that even Karen's smile faltered. The lawyers scrambled to explain, suggesting clerical error, miscommunication, technical oversight, but the excuses crumbled under the weight of the simple fact. A dead man could not have notarized a property transfer. What Ridgeview had presented as law was exposed as fraud. The remainder of the hearing shifted like a tide. Michael spoke of the sabotage, the fabricated inspections, the harassment that had stretched over months, and while the judge warned him to confine himself to relevant matters, he saw in her eyes that she understood the pattern. This was not the defiance of a difficult homeowner, but the persecution of one man by a board that had mistaken power for ownership. In the closing minutes, the judge delivered her ruling with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. The cabin was lawful, the property deed valid, and Ridgeview's actions constituted a gross abuse of authority. The directive to demolish was void, the fines were struck down, and the association was ordered to compensate Michael for the damages caused by their harassment. Karen sat rigid, her face drained of the smug confidence she had worn like armor for months. Around her, the lawyers shuffled their papers, their defeat evident, but she stared straight ahead as though refusing to acknowledge what had just happened. Michael felt no triumph in that moment, only a deep, resonant relief. The battle that had consumed him, that had turned his sanctuary into a fortress under siege, had at last reached its breaking point, and the truth had prevailed in the one place where truth still held weight. As he left the courtroom, the crisp winter air rushing into his lungs, Michael knew the war was not entirely over. Ridgeview would lick its wounds, Karen would scheme again, and the scars of the conflict would linger in the community. But the cabin still stood, his name still lay on the deed, and the weight of their false authority had been stripped bare for all to see. The culmination had arrived, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the steady exposure of lies by the quiet persistence of fact, and that, he thought, was the only kind of victory that mattered. In the weeks that followed the ruling, the snow on the mountains began to soften into rivulets that trickled down through the pines, and the valley slowly shed its winter silence. For the first time in months, Michael woke in the mornings without bracing himself for a notice on the door or a summons in the mailbox, and the absence of that constant dread felt almost disorienting, like stepping out of a storm into a room so quiet. It rang in the ears. The cabin, scarred only by memory, had reclaimed its purpose, and each creak of the timbers or shimmer of light through the broad windows reminded him that it was more than a building. It was proof that truth had held when everything around it had. Bent. Ridgeview itself was changed. Karen no longer drove past in her immaculate SUV, no longer stood at meetings presiding with her brittle smile. no longer carried the easy assumption that her word could override law. Rumors swirled of her resignation, of investigations into her handling of other properties, of neighbors reconsidering what they had once accepted without question. Where there had been whispers against him in the market, Michael now heard cautious greetings, some even accompanied by murmured apologies. He did not seek vindication in their words, nor did he offer more than a nod, but the shift was unmistakable. He was no longer the outsider marked for removal. He was the man who had endured and remained. On a quiet evening, he sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the last of the snow melt into the soil, and thought of how close the cabin had come to being erased. He thought of the glass on his driveway, the altered records, the courtroom silence when the forgery was revealed, and he understood that resilience was not only about defending walls and roofs, but about refusing to surrender to those who thrived on intimidation. What Karen had tried to take was not just land, but certainty, the right to exist without permission from a committee drunk on power, and by standing against her he had reclaimed more than a deed. He had reclaimed the simple truth that some lines cannot be redrawn by those who covet them. The fight had cost him peace, time, and trust in the easy nature of neighbors, but as the cabin settled into the rhythm of spring he realized it had also given him something harder and sharper. A kind of clarity, a steadiness that came only from surviving a storm built not of weather but of human will. He no longer looked at the cabin as an experiment or retreat. It had become a marker of endurance, a testament to the refusal to yield when yielding was the easier path. And in that quiet, with the mountains still rising immutable against the horizon, Michael felt not triumph but something stronger, an unshakable calm, as though the land itself had accepted him at last, not because he had claimed it, but because he had fought to remain,